Kyra,
Yes.
Ryan,
Yes.
Jesse,
Yes.
and I'm also a yes. I think I
Raymond's a
missed
yes.
somebody. Did I miss?
Raymond, I'm a yes.
Okay, sorry. Sorry. Raymond, thank you. We'll move on to public comment period. Please indicate by either hitting the raise hand button, or I think it's *6, is it not? Or *5? *9. Thank you. *9 or hit the raise hand button if you want to address the board for this evening on any agenda item. Please state your name, and you can have up to 3 minutes to address the board. So, Keith, do we have anybody who wants to address the board this evening?
Yes, we do, Mr. Chair. We have, I believe it's Jim Mogensen. Mr. Mogensen, you've been unmuted.
Yes, this is Jim Mogensen. My wife's name is still up there. We haven't figured out how to change that. So the question is, one question is, so why do we have an LAC? And one answer may be 49 CFR 37.137 section C. And that says that there needs to be, there's a whole thing about how disability paratransit is supposed to be operated, and you need to get public comment. And number C is that you have to have some kind of ongoing presence to allow members of the disability community to participate in an ongoing, over time way to provide input as to how things are going and what people think should be happening. And my guess is, I didn't get to the point of the senior, there's probably also another subsection relating to seniors in the same way. And that's probably why we have an LAC, and it mentions on the Federal Transit Administration website that that's the way that most transit authorities have dealt with this, is by having a committee where people can bring their concerns and understandings at a regular meeting. The second thing I wanted to convey was I was talking to someone. They know they talked to me, and they know I'm involved in ATA kind of stuff. And they said to me, when I first came to Ann Arbor, I could get around. They've changed it. Next time, if they have something where I have to vote for it, I'm not going to do that. I will do my best to convince them to change their mind. But this is something that I've been concerned about, not just with this person, but also folks on the south side of Ypsilanti, people who are now using the TheRide. I think that the board needs to keep that in mind as we're doing the changes. I've been following this for a long time and expressing my concerns over a long time. I anticipated some of the changes that have been happening, and I just think that the board needs to keep that in mind as we move forward. Thank you.
Sorry, Jim, I think we lost you for a moment. You're on mute.
I stopped. I actually did stop.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
There you go. Thank you.
Thanks. Keith, do we have anybody else who wants to address the board this evening? At this
We
time?
do not at this time.
Okay. Thanks. We'll go back then to the agenda. General announcements, 1.3 from anybody. Do we have any general announcements from anybody on the board or the staff? Not seeing anything, then we'll go to item 1.4, which is board officer elections. It's going to be a little different this year insofar as we will be doing this for the first time electronically. So we can still, as we always do, take nominations and seconds and votes from the floor. If we have more than one candidate for an elected position, we will have to do a quote-unquote secret ballot. If we don't have paper ballots, we would have to submit our choice for the candidate by email to Matt and Keith. So that's how we'll cover it. But we have technically 3 positions that we need to vote for. Two of them are filled, one is not. We can start with the chair. We have chair, treasurer, and secretary. And we can start with the chair position. Does anybody have any nominations they want to make for chair? Roger,
Nominate Eric Mahler.
any seconds?
Second.
Kyra seconds. Is there any other nominations for the floor for chair? All right. Then we can go through and vote on chair. We'll start with Mike.
I vote yes for Eric Mahler for our chair.
Thank you. Rich,
Definite yes.
Roger,
Yes.
Kyra,
Yes.
Kathleen,
Yes.
Ryan,
Yes.
Jesse,
Yes.
Raymond,
Yes.
and I'm also yes. That passes unanimously. Thank you, everybody. We'll go then to recording secretary. Do I have any nominations from the floor for recording secretary? Mike,
I nominate Kyra Sims.
do you have any seconds for that?
Support.
Support for Rich and Roger. Any other nominations for recording secretary? And we'll go through and record the vote then. Yes or no for Kyra Sims for recording secretary. Mike,
Yes.
Rich,
Yes.
Roger,
Yes.
Kyra,
Yes.
Kathleen,
Yes.
Ryan,
Yes.
Jesse,
Yes.
Raymond,
Yes.
and I'm also a yes, so that's also unanimous. Now we technically have a treasurer position. Last year we discussed that the treasurer position is problematic for us because it is really out of step with, it was created when the board was, when the agency was much, much less than what it was now. All of those roles that were incorporated into the Articles of Incorporation as being treasurer duties are now done in John Metzinger's, or by staff in John Metzinger's organization. And so the treasurer role is pretty much obsolete and doesn't actually really even have the authority to do those things anymore. We are going to be working, I think we found, we originally we thought we may have to go to each and every legal owner of ours to get the Articles of Incorporation changed. We haven't done that, but we think we have a different way to kind of take care of that. But nevertheless, because it is in our bylaws that we, have to vote for one, does anybody want to nominate anybody to be the treasurer?
Do we nominate John?
Unfortunately, it can't be a staff member, or else, but yeah.
I mean, Jesse's on the finance committee, right?
No.
No? Oh.
No.
He's on service.
Ah. Mike?
Thanks for the honor, Rachel. No thanks.
It should be said that we've gone a full year without this role already, so we will be probably working to eliminate the role at some point. I should mention.
Raymond?
Would it be appropriate?
I was gonna go through every square.
Would it be appropriate to move that we leave the role unfilled?
We could simply just not nominate anybody.
All right.
So I'll take that as no nominations from the floor then, and that will go unfilled, and we will solve that. We'll resolve that issue, so we don't have to deal with this next year. Okay, so thank you everybody for the officer elections and the revote, and we'll move on then to our consent agenda. We have board minutes 2.1. We have our FY 2021 calendar fiscal year board meeting approval dates, which are in the packet on page 15. Minutes start on page 3. Committee reports start on page 16. Can I have somebody move our consent agenda?
So moved.
Kathleen, supported by Mike. We'll go through the record then. Yes or no on the consent agenda. Mike,
Yes.
Rich,
Yes.
Roger,
Yes.
Kyra,
Yes.
Kathleen,
Yes.
Ryan,
Yes.
Jesse,
Yes.
Raymond.
Yes.
I'm also a yes. We'll move on then to section 3, the 2021 budget. The first 3.1, our first item is the financial planning budgeting policy 2.4. And that's up for approval at this time. It's in your packet starting on page 26. And I'll leave it to Matt or John, whoever's going to lead us through this discussion to kick it off.
I'm happy to introduce our Chief Financial Officer, Mr. John Messinger.
Thank you, Matt. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As you know, I ran from home when the power went out and made it safely to the office where I'm not sure about my mic. But good evening, everybody. It's good to see you all. It's a big night in terms of reviewing our annual budget. And the first step of that is to take a look at what the board's policy says about the budget. Policy 2.4, compliance with policy 2.4 is the first step toward adopting the annual budget. This policy lists parameters and expectations for the recommended annual budget. And it also addresses the need to make financial plans, to think long-term about the future when making financial plans. So this month, the report on policy 2.4 went to the Finance Committee. And as are stated in the minutes, the committee recommends the board accept the monitoring report as compliant. But let's take a little bit of time to look at the policy in a little more detail, especially for members of the public who may be less familiar with that. So this policy reinforces the importance of another board policy, 2.5. Policy 2.5 addresses financial conditions and activities. That policy is monitored at a separate time to coincide with the presentation of the annual audit. Therefore, the board's policies, in essence, bookend our fiscal year. They describe how the budget and how we should budget and how to plan for the year in advance, and then how financial activities should be handled during the year and how they need to be reported at the end of the year in the audited financials. Policies 2.42, 2.43, and 2.44 all emphasize the requirement for a multi-year plan that considers how the one-year budget fits into the bigger picture. So therefore, the discussion this month is not just about the annual budget itself, but also about the context of strategy and our planning assumptions that show the operating budget, capital budget, and their impacts in a longer range budget forecast. The remaining sub-policies set up important limitations that require the budget to be balanced, to provide a cushion of reserve funding as a safety net, and to fund the board's work in governing the AAATA. We also have a policy that prohibits debt and other unfunded obligations. In the monitoring report are the results of a survey. Board members surveyed earlier in the month to indicate where they were with regard to compliance. And we did receive some very interesting feedback, as was discussed at the Finance Committee and are reflected in that committee's minutes. The board is interested in seeing more frequent monitoring of financial policy compliance, especially during these times of economic uncertainty. So the Finance Committee discussed this, and staff are certainly willing to provide additional reporting beyond the quarterly financial reports as needed. So that concludes this report, and Eric will return to you for questions.
Okay. Any discussion from the board on the monitoring report in our packet today on 2.4? Any questions or discussion items for Matt or John?
So this is Rich. I actually was one of the ones that had some comments on it, and it wasn't anything negative or bad. It was just a potential option to consider, maybe even a potential policy. And it was around the frequency of maybe having something that triggered, because for me, I view the policies more as an overarching rule book that we follow irrespective of who's actually in the seats of CEO or any other positions, right? And we have an awesome team right now, and we're getting timely updates, but we never know what happens as time ticks on. And so I was kind of wondering if there maybe should be some kind of trigger that says when ridership falls below X amount of riders, because we're pretty dependent on that revenue stream, that the frequency of the updates in some form, like we definitely don't want to cause it where it has to be some kind of like formal, time-consuming process for John or his team, or even for Matt, that we as the board at least get some updates. I mean, they're doing that right now, but I don't know if that's something worthwhile to get down on paper, that there's some trigger that then we request that they do something timely with us with updates. Because I think right now the policy is maybe once a quarter, technically you only have to give it to us. And we've been getting it almost, I think, sometimes weekly from them, which has been awesome, but there wasn't really anything that directs them that they have to do that.
So I guess just to clarify your suggestion, are you want to see a change? You have some suggested language or additional timing you'd like to see? I mean, I think you made it pretty clear that hey, if ridership falls below X amount in I guess a week or a month or something like that, we may require additional reporting at some higher frequency or interval.
Yep.
Do we just want to talk conceptually about that, or do you have some specific language you want us to consider?
I did put some potential language. I don't have it in front of me though. Well, let me pull that up. And I'm definitely not saying that is the appropriate language. Sorry, I'm just trying to find the page number. Oh, here we are. Okay. During times of economic uncertainty, such as a pandemic, where daily ridership has fallen below X% of normal levels, the CEO shall provide a monitoring report every, and it was just more some time period cadence.
Yeah. I guess discussion on that item then. Any comments or consideration, questions from board members about Mr. Chang's suggested language?
As it says in the minutes to the Finance Committee meeting, we discussed that a fair amount. And we were hoping actually that we could get some input from other board members who were not on the Finance Committee, see what they think.
So I guess just for my own idea about how to think about this, are you suggesting, well, I guess what kind of form would we be requiring the staff to produce at this time? I mean, is it something as, well, I guess help me understand what kind of reporting you would want if we went below X% of, historical levels or something like that. Like what would you be thinking? What's your idea?
That's a really good question. I really like the format that John has actually been presenting, but I know that's a lot of work. And so maybe there's just some subset in there, especially just, I mean, the graph was really helpful of showing where like the different scenarios of if we do X, then the revenue could look like this, and when it intersects at this particular date. I personally don't want it to be like this full-fledged, full of words thing. Maybe just the cash flow table, but I don't know how much effort. I guess maybe that's the question, right, John? Is like how much effort went into those reports that you're giving us already? I imagine a lot, and it's not just you, it's your whole team that's involved in that.
Yeah, it does take some effort to put them together. The finance department performs monthly closes, and then that data would be available and we could extract the data that the board would want to see at that time. But I will mention that there is a lag in the finance team's ability and timeliness to be able to close out a month. it's usually about as much as 60 days after the month closes before we have the financial clarity, because of lagging invoices and other transactions that occur late.
Would it be too open to just say that it's to be determined how the information is presented to us? Because it could be a more on a case-by-case basis, that there might be certain information that's best reported at that particular time, but I also know if that openness causes more problems in regards to being too vague.
Well, I mean, here would be my suggestions. I don't. I mean, I guess I tend to think of it as a recession kind of thing. Like if we're recessing, so like, recession is defined as kind of a slowdown in GDP for 2 quarters or more. So, I mean, would you be willing to consider instead of, hey, this quarter we dipped, whatever percentage, 15%, let's say, below year over year this quarter last year, but we'll do 2 consecutive quarters of a 10% dip or something like that, then we will require, ridership data on a weekly basis for the entire next quarter or bi-weekly basis, along with, supplementary budget requests and things like that. I'm trying to think through, I want it to be meaningful so we don't, react and, to every single dip in ridership. At the same time, I don't want to wait too late so we're already on, the edge of panic before we get the data, and, the staff is coming to us for, emergency budget requests and things like that. So I'm trying to strike a balance between that. I don't want to react to every single thing, though, you know what I mean? So I'm trying to think about it, but Raymond, you had a hand up.
Yeah, I was just curious if maybe a mechanism that might work is if our reserve dips below like 2 months or something like that, because to me the reserve is a reflection of fare box, our state funding, all the different pieces that kind of come together, and then our revenues minus our liabilities. So I just wonder if maybe that's a more holistic sort of trigger for that, and then we could say if it dips below 2 months of reserve, then we would expect monthly reports on our financial situation, balance sheets, or like Richard said, like cash flow or something to that effect.
So I like that. I guess a concern maybe I would have on that is, I'm not to say that this team would do that, but there could be ways to manipulate it so that they never end up dipping into the reserves, I guess, right? Because they could take actions of maybe even doing cuts on the operational side so that you actually aren't dipping into the reserves, but in reality, the money situation is really not that great. But I like where that's going, right? Because I agree between you and Eric and the rest of the teams. I don't want this to become something where all of a sudden it's just like triggering all this time with these false positives.
Well, I think that's the debate. Is it what is the proper trigger? Is it a financial or is it a dip in ridership, trigger, right? So I mean, if we saw 2 months in a row of consecutive 10% dip year over year from the previous quarter, let's say. Maybe it doesn't have to be quarterly, right? Because I don't want to wait 6 months to say, all right, yeah, we're in deep trouble. So maybe if we see, year over, consecutive months of a 10% dip. I'm just throwing some numbers out there. Consecutive months of a 10% dip in ridership year over year compared to February and March of last year is both 10% down from February and March of year before, we will require, something, some financial reporting or some special something like that. I'm just throwing that out there to give people something to react to. But I guess I'd like to hear from other board members what they think, and then we can circle back to the staff to see what they think would be the most appropriate trigger point. The other board members first. Anybody else?
Let me just add one thing. that would be informative on this topic. There's various provisions, policies about no surprises to the board where the CEO needs to notify the board. And I don't have those memorized. I'm sure Matt does. However, and I was wondering if Matt could give some insights about what kinds of things he's, according to our current policies, he's already obligated to inform the board about.
Yeah, I guess it would be interesting to know. I mean, I guess if I, well, I won't speak for Matt, but I guess I'd be interested to know what you would think would be a surprise or what would constitute no surprise in this kind of case. Um, Perhaps it's, speaking as a board member, I think if we got to the point where we were making material cutbacks in staff and service or something that materially affected the level of service for the organization before we were notified, and Matt just said, yeah, by the way, I had to lay off 15% of the staff because ridership's down 10% consecutive quarters, that would be concerning. But maybe Matt, you can jump in and then we can circle back to the board members. Go ahead.
Sure, thank you. Mike is correct. It's policy 21112 obligates me to tell you of any anticipated non-compliance with your policy, regardless of the schedule for monitoring. So what that means is if it comes to my attention that I'm not going to be able to comply with the reserve policy or any of the financial policies or any of the other policies, I need to tell you regardless of what time it is, you know, according to the schedule. So that does exist. It's a little vague on the trigger, and I sense you guys are sort of talking about what would trigger it, but in this case, it says non-compliance with the policy. You also, frankly, don't need to rationalize why you want to monitor something more frequently. You just decide to do it. You can either change the frequency of the monitoring. If it's once a year, you can change it to every month. And under 21115, that policy, you spell out specifically what you'd like to see, including your quarterly financial report. So that's another mechanism. If you voted today simply to say, we'd like to see cash flow more frequently to be worked out with the finance committee and staff, you know, we can do that. There are existing mechanisms, I guess, in the policy manual to allow that to occur. You can just say you want to do it for the next 12, 18 months, and you don't have to give a reason.
Roger, I think, did you have a hand up?
I guess you know, given the pandemic that we're going through, I think it might be a good idea to have something ridership, maybe more than just 10%, say maybe 20 or 25% dip in ridership would trigger reporting, at least to the finance committee, of what impact this is going to have on our adopted budget. Something, you know, not something where you have to generate a huge number of reports, but something, here's a key element, a key indicator that something's wrong. What financial impact is this going to have on the budget? So I guess I would lean in something like that, but it should be a pretty significant trigger. Something, you know, the 20, 30% drop in ridership would be pretty dramatic, which of course is what we've experienced now, but I doubt we've experienced anything like that in the past.
Maybe other people from service can jump in, because I'm thinking where we're going with this is maybe not resolve it here and now, but I think I'd like to hear from other service committee members and then have the finance committee take a look at this and come back next board meeting with a recommendation that we can vote on. So they have something to work through and they have the comments of other board members. Maybe if other service committee members have any ideas or suggestions or support or non-support, this would be the time to weigh in and give the finance committee something to think about. So Jesse or Ryan, anybody else? Kathleen, go ahead.
I, at this time, don't have any suggestions, but I support what Richard has proposed. I see a lot of value in that, especially with everything that's going on right now. And I certainly understand, you know, we've been blessed with a brilliant executive team, and the transparency is wonderful, but we do also need to consider that we shouldn't just have our policies in place for our current team, but for our future as well, future boards and future teams. So I would like to see us look to work on this.
Anybody else with any comments?
Actually, I'd like to just jump back to what Kathleen was saying. In terms of working on this for creating a sustaining structure, what might that look like, or is that maybe another discussion for a committee?
Any reaction to that, Rich? I mean, in terms of, I guess you can give it some thought based on the comments you have here. I mean, that's kind of a larger question, but if you have any reaction to what Ryan said, or if you want to think about it, that's fine.
Well, I think overall is something I think we just want to see if this is something that the board overall would support investigating further, and then we can take it into committee. And I think your plan of having finance discuss this and then present it to service, and then we get the wording or something like that. Because I really appreciated everyone's views. I really like what Roger said, so I'm glad this is recorded, because then I can actually pull it back up and then write down all the words that he put out there.
Yep.
So yeah, I'll gladly take this on and work on this.
Okay.
We'll certainly add it to the agenda for the next finance committee meeting.
Very good. Any other comment, questions on, on the discussion about amending the policy? We still have to vote on the monitoring policy itself. So any questions on this topic before we close it out and vote on the policy? No. Then any discussion on the monitoring report itself from the staff? Okay, don't see anybody. Then we can vote on the monitoring policy itself. We can approve it as in compliance. We can approve it with exceptions. We can approve it with, the usual in compliance or compliance except for limited items noted, or not in compliance, or substantially, working on it or in progress. So could I have somebody move a suggestion or recommendation? Mike?
I suggest that we go along with what the unanimous view of the finance committee is, that it is in compliance.
So a second for that?
Second.
Kyra? We'll go through and vote on that then. As being in compliance, that's the motion on the floor. Yes or no, Mike?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Roger?
Yes.
Kyra?
Yes.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Ryan?
Yes.
Jesse?
Yes.
Raymond?
Yes.
And I'm also a yes. So that is moved into the record. Thank you, everybody. We'll move on then to 3.2, and this is our fiscal year 2021 budget approval item. And I'll turn it back over listed to Mr. Metzinger. So go ahead, John.
Thank you. So Mike will be bringing up the slide presentation here in a moment, but after presenting the draft budget to the board last month, we made a few changes. So tonight we're going to be presenting to you the recommended budget for adoption. Now, state law requires the adoption of a budget before there are any expenditures in the new fiscal year, and our fiscal year begins next week, October 1st. So tonight we'll be asking the board to adopt a 12-month budget, recognizing that it is likely to change after the implications of the state budget are fully known. And I'll mention that the state budget was adopted late yesterday. We're still beginning to unpack that and understand what it means for our budget. So we'll have more to say about that in this presentation. The pandemic has brought about a great time of uncertainty and chaotic change. And in particular, we've been concerned about our revenues throughout the entire budget process. It's been this context that has created a struggle for the RIDE to find the right balance between competing priorities and budgeting. There is a very strong desire to restore services as quickly as possible and as prudently as possible. We are balancing serving essential needs while avoiding crowding on transit vehicles in order to promote public health and safety, all while ensuring that the agency is financially solvent so that we can continue to meet needs not only today, but also tomorrow. In spite of the struggles that it took to get us to this point tonight, I believe the recommended budget has sought to find the right balance between all of those priorities. And tonight we are presenting a balanced budget that allows for gradual restoration of services over the next year. It's a sustainable budget that offers flexibility in its capacity to expand or contract as needed. And it also provides for us confidence in a path forward that is at least clear for the next year during these uncertain times. So let's begin with an overview of the budget itself. As I mentioned, several revisions have been made since last month, and I'll detail those for you tonight on an upcoming slide. The recommended budget is a $43.2 million operating budget. That's $2 million higher than the first draft that was presented last month. And that's in order to allow for a higher level of service to be operated. It is a $6.5 million capital budget, which is focused primarily upon maintaining state of good repair upon our current assets. As I mentioned, it is balanced, and primarily we're able to balance the budget through the use of CARES Act funding to support service recovery during and after the pandemic. And as required by your policy, the budget provides a multi-year operating budget forecast as well as a 10-year plan for capital investments. Let's dive into the revisions that were made since the draft budget was presented in August. There is additional expense, as I mentioned, of $2.6 million. We've added $955,000 in funding for a new paratransit contract to be awarded in August, according to the current plan. And as we'll see later in the presentation, it's necessary for us to bring paratransit services back out of house so that we can open capacity within our own facility and staffing for fixed route expansion. So that's currently planned for August. We've added $869,000 in salaries and wages by adding drivers for additional service recovery and staff to support additional vehicle and facility cleaning. In all, we plan to recall 13 drivers who will be needed to restore service on the fixed route systems to about 2/3 the regular level of service. And then we've also added 6 service crew positions in the budget, and those will be needed for the additional COVID-related cleaning in the vehicles and in the facilities. And we truly think that that level of cleaning is going to continue to be demanded by transit riders in the years to come. So those are permanent positions in the budget. Another change is a $629,000 addition in federal and state non-urban pass-through funding. This was a late arriving budget request that came from WAVE and from People's Express. Those are rural transit providers that provide service in Washtenaw County, and they receive those state and federal dollars as pass-through funding through our authority. So there's a net zero effect on the budget. We'll have revenue coming in that will match those expenses. In all, costs are offset by $1.96 million in additional CARES Act funding and state operating assistance, plus the additional state and federal pass-through amounts for WAVE and People's Express. Looking more closely at the capital budget, we decreased the capital budget by $4.2 million since the August draft. This requires a little bit of explanation, and we have been discussing this in the committees this month. Due to lower mileage with some fleet going unused and because of manufacturing delays in order to buy new buses because of the pandemic, we are recommending the deferral of replacing 8 buses in 2021. Normally, we replace 8 buses each year, but this year we have a one-time opportunity to defer the purchase of 8 buses. The new plan is to carry that $4.2 million in 2021 funding over for use in future years for another purpose. We will have 5 years to use those dollars, and we'd like to consider using those funds for a future facility investment, such as the YTC, the BTC, or possible garage expansion. Of course, it'll be required by the board's policy for us to have further board authorizations later on for any facility investments to come. So we'll certainly be discussing how that $4.2 million might be used. And again, I'll just emphasize that this deferral is a one-time opportunity. We will need to return to investing in the fleet annually beginning in 2022. Let's take a closer look at the operating revenues. This pie chart shows kind of where that $43.1 million, $43.2 million in revenue comes from. You can see that the budget relies upon local property taxes at 38%, state operating assistance provides 25%, and CARES Act funding is the next highest source at 15%. Passenger fares are budgeted at about half our regular fare revenue due to lower ridership demand, covering about 8% of costs. And then the other costs are shown there for you. As we've been discussing, state operating assistance has been the greatest uncertainty during this summer's budget cycle. As I mentioned, the state adopted a budget yesterday. Details are still to be made more clear by MDOT, but I'll share that it looks like operating assistance was cut slightly and capital matching funding has been maintained. So that's less bad news than we've expected. So we'll just call it good news. Funding challenges still appear in the longer term budget forecast, but state revenue was better than expected for 2020. So we'll have more details to share with the board in the next month or two as we begin to unpack the state budget and its impact on our agency's budget. A closer look at the operating expenses shows that about 56% of our costs are for employee pay and benefits. Again, emphasizing the importance of the work that all of our staff does in delivering public transportation services to our service area. Purchase transportation is the second highest expense at $7.5 million or 19% of total costs. That's down 34%, which is pretty considerable from the current budget year, again, due to our operation of TheRide in-house for most of the new budget year. And other costs include fuel and supplies at 11%, contract services, including janitorial and snow removal at 8%, and other costs. Let's take a little closer look at the capital budget. The capital budget funds investments in all of our assets, including land, building, vehicles, and equipment. As I mentioned, it's $4.2 million lower than the first draft due to the deferral of the buses. You know, we're often asked by board members and stakeholders in the community, what is the priority for capital investment? There are 4 priorities. They're listed here in the order of importance. And as you can see by the dollar amount of the investment, the highest priority is to maintain vehicles and facilities and equipment in a state of good repair. That's required by the board's policy, specifically policy 2.8, asset protection. But it's also required by FTA and MDOT as requirements of using their grant funds. Secondary priorities tend to be more flexible. Currently, in this year's budget, our next highest priority is for expansion of facilities. For 2021, we've budgeted funding for the possible acquisition of additional land, as well as to study the need for a new garage, given that our current garage is at its limit. So there are additional priorities in the capital budget. These include adding value, such as improving bus stops and research and development projects that can bring about innovation. I will note that one key thing to understand is that capital funding is not available to support operations. It must be used for capital investment. I want to show you a chart that you may not have seen yet, because we want to be very clear about what this budget is bringing to the table in terms of restoration of fixed route service over time. So what this chart shows is the level of service as a percentage of our 100% level of service operated in 2019 and then through February of 2020 before the pandemic hit. So there are many factors that are going to impact this timeline. Planning work continues on service restoration, and we'll be having discussions with the board about that throughout the year. You can see in this chart that we had a 100% level of service in February 2020 before the pandemic arrived. That declined sharply to 30% by April, and then gradually began to restore since then to 62% of our level of service in August, And our budget allows for an expansion to 66% or 2/3 the regular level of service by November, before nearly full service restoration is possible in August 2021. A key milestone, as I mentioned, is the onboarding of a new TheRide contractor to add capacity. And if that happens in August, that's when you see that sharp increase. It would allow the redeployment of 50 bus operators restored to fixed route service. It's an additional 30% level of service. So we'll see, based upon plans, if we can move more quickly than this, but this is a good picture about what service recovery might look like in the budget. I also want to address the CARES Act. Many people have asked about CARES Act funds and why we aren't spending them more quickly. This has been somewhat controversial because our decision-making has been financially conservative, and we aren't spending as fast as some people may expect us to. So I want to spend a little bit of time tonight addressing these questions head on. The budget document also has been revised to provide a little greater detail on how CARES Act funding is being utilized in the budget and in the long-range plan. I'll just mention that CARES Act funding is so key to the TheRide service recovery that we understand that this is an important topic for the board and for the public. In April, TheRide received $20.7 million as a grant award through the CARES Act, and these are federal funds that are available to reimburse eligible expenses, such as those that are listed here on this slide. Our approach has been to use funding to meet immediate needs, such as those listed, and also to support restoration of services through the pandemic and through its economic aftershocks. So we've been careful to pay attention to the short-term needs, but also very close attention to the long-term needs, which is why we've taken a more conservative approach. The planned timing for the use of funds is this table, which has been added to the budget book. I'll just mention that this is likely to change. We're very much likely to be using the funding more quickly than is predicted in this table as needs arrive, as they arise next year and in 2022. So where we're currently plotting this is that we're going to use about 12% of the funding this year for fiscal year 2020. We'll use about half of that by the end of 2021, and then 83% by the end of 2022. We've decided quite consciously that we were going to conserve resources to preserve the organization from this great economic uncertainty that has arisen out of the pandemic. And I'll just say that we are now in a very strong position because of these decisions. And we are in a position now that we can discuss restoring services with the funding that we now have at a time when other transit agencies may be needing to discuss cuts. So I want to go here with you just to share some headlines. These are recent headlines in the last couple of weeks. If you want to see what the alternative might have looked like for us, we can look to transit agencies like New York, Denver, and Washington, D.C. These agencies did not make difficult decisions early on, and I would suspect that they couldn't do it because of the size of the organization and because of their governance style. They couldn't be very limber in making the types of decisions that we've been able to make. But the result is that they have all burned through their CARES Act funding or are very close to burning through that funding and are now facing dire financial consequences. They're predicting catastrophic service cuts, severe layoffs, and they're facing major financial risks of insolvency. And they all continue to wait for federal bailouts, which have not yet materialized. And so this is a real challenge for those authorities. I want to focus a little bit kind of on a smaller scale because I do recognize that the New York MTA and Denver RTD and Washington, D.C. transit agencies are much larger than we are here in the Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti area. But I want to say that I have been trying very hard to get some form of national benchmarking on CARES Act funding so that we can compare our own progress versus our peers. Unfortunately, it's not available from FTA. I checked and I even pushed, but they were unwilling to share the data that all transit agencies report quarterly. However, the Regional Transit Authority will be collecting data on funding use within Southeast Michigan. And I think this will be a pretty good peer group for us to compare with, at least a local peer group. So we'll be able to share more details later on as we progress on how CARES Act funding are being used in Southeast Michigan and in our transit agency. What we're hearing and talking directly to our peers is that most of our agencies of our peer size are following a very similar conservative path. This is certainly the case in our region. DTC, which operates the Detroit People Mover, M1 Rail that operates the Q Line, and RTA are not operating. They have not resumed operations since the onset of the pandemic, and they are still executing grant awards for CARES Act funding. So that means they have not even started to spend the CARES Act funding that's shown here just yet. SMART and DDOT are operating reduced schedules, and they are using CARES Act funds to support a longer term approach, very similar to what we're doing here at this authority. So I'll just say that these are very much local decisions. There is no national standard, or we're not under pressure from MDOT or others to spend rapidly or slowly. There's no right or wrong way to go. I can assure the board and our community that we have done the very best we can do with our pandemic recovery plan, focusing upon public health and safety, service recovery, and of course, long-term sustainability. Tonight, we've come to the time in our annual budget cycle for the board to adopt the budget. A draft resolution for budget adoption is included in the board meeting packet. And as has been mentioned previously, we're likely to continue work on the budget into next year, especially after we have greater clarity regarding the state budget. So we can come back with budget amendments as necessary, as shown here on this timeline. Before I return to the chair for questions, I would just like to take a moment to recognize and thank the many people who have contributed to budget development during this year's budget cycle. Special thanks goes to all of the TheRide senior management team members, including Mr. Ron Copeland, who's now retired. Each of these managers were directly involved in building their department budgets this year. Latasha Thompson, our finance manager, was also a great support in putting together all of our fringe costs and many other contributions to the budget development. I want to thank our executive team, especially Matt Carpenter for your leadership, Matt, as well as staff members Caitlin Conway, Samantha, Rosa Maria, and Keith for all of your support. And of course, the board of directors, particularly the finance committee. Thank you all for your contributions. To wrap up, the pandemic has brought us a great time of uncertainty and chaotic change. That's the context for the budget. But in spite of these struggles, we're at this point tonight, and I can attest that we have found the right balance with this recommended budget. So tonight, we're asking the board to adopt a balanced budget that allows for gradual restoration of services over the next year. It's a sustainable budget that offers flexibility in order to allow us to be able to expand as needed. And it's also a budget that delivers for us a clear path forward with confidence during these challenging times. So we've covered a lot of ground over these last few months. Thank you for your attention during these budget presentations. Really appreciate that. And I'm happy to return to the chair for questions.
All right, thank you, John, well done. And I'll open it up. One question that immediately came to my mind, and I don't know if John, you're the right person, maybe it's Matt or Brian or all three of you, but I'm sure members of the public will wonder, based on the not as bad as we thought message that we may be getting from the state, and probably not as deep a cut in the overall operating top line revenue that we thought we were going to have, perhaps. Members of the public might want to know at what level of service might this budget allow us to restore service to going forward, or compared to now, how quickly, how soon, et cetera, based on where we think these numbers are. Understanding that we may have to adjust again in a quarter or whatever. So, but maybe one or more of you can comment on that for the public's sake.
Sure, I'll jump in just because I probably have the closest ear to Lansing. So the budget has been a very interesting sausage grinder this year. They did pass it. We had heard essentially the state budget was more or less finished on Friday last week. And then earlier this week, there were some machinations in the Transportation Committee. There were some cuts to transit operating funding. That was the big thing that I think we had signaled to you had our attention and was the single biggest factor in our decisions really about service restoration. but I'm happy to report that the cuts appear to be very minor, 1.5% to 2%. So that gives us a lot more confidence going forward that we can bring you an amendment probably in the next couple of months to begin accelerating service restoration. We have more confidence that that is something that we will have the wherewithal to do. However, we do need to be clear with you and with the public about the risks that are inherent in that. One of the things I saw today, just learning about the budget, from what it appears from the reports, the state used its own CARES Act funding and drew down several of its reserves to backfill many other parts of their budget. So they used one-time money to maintain operating spending. Whether or not they can continue to do that in fiscal year 2022 and 2023 remains to be seen. However, if they didn't have to cut it this year, that gives us some confidence. So the executive team has interpreted this as very positive. It's too recent, unfortunately, for me to make any sort of commitments this evening about how much and how fast, but it certainly is heading in the right direction from that perspective. And so I suspect we will be coming back to you an amendment, maybe even before the end of the calendar year, to change how fast we're drawing down the CARES Act funding, for example, maybe putting more of that into service and trying to get as much as we can back on the road. But we really want to fully unpack what's actually in the budget. And then finally, sort of a bigger picture point, and I think Brian Smith had the best observation about this. Essentially what the state has done is kick the can down the road. They've avoided hard budget cutting decisions in most cases with this one-time funding, possibly because they're just waiting to see what happens with the presidential election in November. And one way or another, will that have an effect on additional federal relief for states or local governments and possibly the transit industry as well? So the magic 8 ball is clearing up a little bit. Situation is becoming more positive, and we hope to come back to you in the next couple of months with specifics about accelerating the return of our services.
Thank you. Other board members, questions, comments, discussion on the budget? Kathleen?
Hi, thank you, Mr. Mueller. My question is for John, and I'm bringing this up because it's come up in public meetings from the public, and it's a question I want settled in my mind. Hang on, it's gotten quite dark in here. All right. So the A2D2 or the D2A2 and TheRide services are budgeted, but they're funded by other sources, if I'm correct. And I know the public has been concerned about how we have been bringing services back up online with fixed route. And I just would like some clarification for myself and for the public that as we bring fixed routes up online, that budget has absolutely nothing to do with D2A2 and Flex and TheRide. Those are separate budget line items and come from other funding sources and don't affect us. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I remember this coming up in a prior board meeting too. So D2A2 is a service that's funded entirely from pass-through funding by RTA. So if that service doesn't operate, we're not using local dollars for that project in essence. So that has no bearing upon the fixed route service. TheRide is similar in the sense that it's a public-private partnership with Michigan Flyer. And so generally speaking, and before the pandemic, it was a profit-generating operation for us. So we did not lose money on that service. It's hard to know what would happen with ridership on that route that might allow some of our costs, to be, we may have some costs related to that. But I would look to Matt to see what the status is. Both are budgeted, they're planned in the budget, but they are, I've not heard about whether or not they're actually going to be restored. Matt?
Sure, thank you, John. So the RTA will make a decision about when and whether to restart funding for the D2A2 service. We have expressed to them that we're ready to restart it now. We can go anytime they're ready to pay the bills. The RTA board wants to move, I think, cautiously. So they've asked their staff to conduct some additional surveying work. Hopefully, at some point, they will find what they were looking for with that information and be prepared to give us the green light to restart that service, in which case it would probably be less than a month to be able to restart. But really, the ball is in the RTA's court. With TheRide, it's a private service in a lot of ways, and we piggyback on it. So as air traffic has collapsed nationally, I was reading about 90%, the market for TheRide service also collapsed, and they suspended that service themselves. I suspect they want to get it back open, but like many things, air travel is very contingent on how safe people feel flying. And that's going to be a particular one that I think we could see a lag in recovery, even after vaccines are available, even after people are generally comfortable traveling locally and regionally. They may still avoid airplanes. So time will tell about TheRide, but generally John is right. Our budget is kind of budget neutral to those two services, and they kind of pay for themselves or they're paid for by others.
Kathleen, any follow-up to that, or?
No, I don't have any follow-up. I just think it was important to have that discussion just because it came up several different times during public comment during the August period. And I just wanted to put the public's mind at rest, or at least that concern to rest.
Okay, thank you. Other discussion, Raymond?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I just want to take a moment to thank staff for the preparation of this budget. We're obviously dealing with unprecedented times, and it's, you know, everybody's crystal ball says something different, I think. I know I've been lovingly nudging staff to figure out ways to restore service as soon as possible because, you know, there are many people in our community that are dependent upon it. I see a lot of positive signs on tonight's report, as well as the report we received at the Finance Committee. I really like seeing the addition of, you know, going from 60-ish% up to 66%. I think that's positive that we're going to see some additional service restoration in the not too distant future. And then what we heard from Mr. Carpenter this evening about, you know, that the news coming from the state is not quite as dire as we had anticipated will also hopefully allow us to restore some service. So that addresses some of the heartburn that you've heard me express in past meetings, both at this board meeting as well as Finance Committee meetings. You know, again, I do give a lot of credit, all the credit to staff for really figuring out ways for us to navigate these troubled waters and kind of keep us in a strong financial position, but also trying to be respectful of the needs of the community. And so I will be happy to support the budget tonight. It was something I've been kind of playing back and forth, but now that I see some positive signs on the horizon, I'm happy to support it. But I will continue to beat the drum that if months go by and we don't see additional service restoration, you know, calling upon staff to, you know, explain and what's happening. So anyway, I just wanted to give kudos where it's due to staff and really making the best of kind of a bad situation and really keeping the agency ahead of the game and really on sound financial footing. So thank you to everybody who worked on this.
Thank you. Other comments, questions, statements from board members? It's one of the advantages of looking at the budget for 3 or 4 months is that by the time you get to the end, you don't have a whole lot of debate. That's a good thing. Then we have in our packet then a resolution. It's resolution 7. I won't read it, but that's the resolution we'll be voting on with the operation totals, and the capital totals are in the resolution. So can I have somebody move resolution 7 into the record? Kathleen, support by Mike. We'll go through the yes or no on the budget and vote this up or down. Mike?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Roger?
Yes.
Kyra?
Yes.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Ryan?
Yes.
Jesse?
Yes.
Raymond?
Yes.
I'm also a yes. So thank you again, John, Matt, and everybody who was on that sheet for all their hard work. We certainly appreciate that. And we appreciate the foresight and the diligence in putting this together once again. Thank you, John. We'll move on then to section 4, which is our policy monitoring and development section. 4.1, committee meeting discussion. Is there anything from our consent agenda, the minutes from any of the meetings that anybody wanted to raise at this time regarding committee meetings? Okay. Then we'll move on to monitoring reports. 4.2. We had in our packet policy 3.0 and 4.0. These are in the packets, and I want to vote on it, but I also want to have a discussion about voting on these 2 items in general. As usual, when we grade ourselves, we think we're doing a heck of a job with this, complying with our own policies, and I'm glad to see that. Especially 3.0, we think we're doing a mostly good job, and 4.0, doing a really good job. So any comments or questions on the monitoring report? Anything up for a vote, but thank you for your attention to it. Mike?
We had a fair amount of discussion in the Finance Committee, in particular about 3.0. And I guess I want to hear any other people on the committee to chime in here. They have a different view of what was discussed. But I have a strong opinion regarding 3.0. You look at it, and it's the board assessment of CEO/organization performance. And then you look at the wording, and it just says what the purpose is. And I don't see that the purpose is a way to assess performance. I don't, so I don't really think that can be graded, other than if somebody wants to say that's a lousy purpose or something. But that's, to me, purpose is not the same as performance.
Yeah, and I think that leads into the discussion I wanted to have, which is, 3.0 and 4.0 as general statements are really kind of it's the headline for the rest of the article, right? So, I mean, you wouldn't grade somebody's journalism based on the headline necessarily. The 3.0 and 4.0, really what tells you if we're compliant or not is all the sub policies that go along with that. And 3.0, 4.0 are kind of the I don't know, the kind of the reason that those policies exist, or the kind of the headline. But are we, I guess the bottom line is it appropriate to in fact just vote for 3.0 and 4.0 as a separate single policy that we're complying with, given the fact that we have dozens of sub policies and sub policies underneath those that tell us if we're what those actually mean. So 3.0 doesn't mean anything insofar as it's further defined by all the policies within 3.0 or underneath 3.0. Same thing for 4.0. So I guess this is something we talked about at governance. Sounds like there was some healthy discussion about this at finance, and I guess I wanted to hear from other board members in the future. Is this something that people struggled with voting for? Did you have no problem when you read it saying yes or no, or is it is it something we can skip over in the past and just go straight to the actual meaningful policies underneath that? So, any thoughts about that from any board members? Any opinions one way or the other? mean, if there's no strong opinions, we'll leave them in there and keep voting on them year after year, but I'm not sure if we need to vote on those. That would be my recommendation, is just to be clear on it. I want to have discussion. My personal recommendation is we can probably skip past it and go straight to the other ones. But if people feel we need to vote on them, we can keep them in.
I agree to not vote on these heading policies and vote on the sub policies. And I agree with Mike's comments, especially about 3.0, that it's difficult and really not appropriate to judge the purpose of the board as, you know, whether we're in compliance with that.
Yeah, I mean, Mike has a good point that and Kyra too, that the purpose that is stated there doesn't necessarily match up, or there's not a causal relationship between the headline, which is board assessment of CEO org performance, and then 3.0, which just tells you what the heck the board's job is, right? So it's not necessarily, there's kind of a disconnect there. It's not, one doesn't necessarily, the headline or the title of 3.0 doesn't necessarily lead into naturally or flow into the statement that you see at 3.0, right? So we could either think about revising the wording of 3.0 to match that. We could think about changing the board assessment of CEO performance to match the statement, or we could just kind of say it stands alone. They each stand alone, and we don't need to vote on them. Others, any other opinions? If not, I'll make an executive decision. We'll just skip that for next time, based on the fact that the two elected officers just said, the heck with it. Any other comments, questions? Okay. All right, and we can get back to the agenda. I think 4.3 is a report out on LAC. And we'll turn to Kathleen to give an update on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since our last board meeting, Mr. Carpenter, Ms. Rose Mercier, and myself have met, and we had a discussion centered on the function of the LAC and options on how to move forward. Mr. Carpenter has a draft issue brief that we've been working on, and once it's solidified, it will be presented to the governance committee, and then we'll go from there to finance and service committee. Is that correct, Matt? Before it goes to the full board, there really isn't a lot of momentum right now. We're just sort of at the draft stage, correct?
Yeah, I think it's still very much a work in progress. But one thing maybe should be clarified. I think the suggestion or recommendation, I think the board delegated to you bringing back some ideas for discussion. So I don't recall saying it or hearing that it should go to governance, but I could have just missed that point.
In last board meeting, Mr. Mahler had suggested that it should start in governance with me and you.
Thank you.
Did I? Okay, and so that was why, or what I was thinking is that would be the appropriate place to then bring the draft issue brief to the governance committee to get that part started, since that is how Mr. Mahler had wanted, or it seemed that that's how, Eric, you wanted to proceed. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's where we're at. We've got a draft issue brief, and I guess the next step would be to bring it to solidify the draft, and then bring it to the governance committee. Correct? Does that work for you, Eric?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's all I have.
Okay. Thank you. If we can assist in any way in the drafting or anything else or bounce ideas off us, let me know. I want to talk for a second on 4.4 board retreat. We don't have one right now. We kind of said at the beginning when the world was shutting down in total and we entered into the dark ages of this pandemic that, hey, we're not going to obviously want to have a retreat this year. But I want to put it out on the table so we don't lose that. Perhaps we can discuss among the board members having some kind of virtual retreat, it obviously, we wouldn't be able to enjoy the same level of interaction. We probably have to have a different format. We may have to adjust what we want to do. But I guess I want to see if the board members in attendance tonight have an appetite for maybe exploring a board retreat, asking the governance committee to look into what that might look like. We could certainly do some benchmarking and take the temperature of other virtual retreats to the extent there are any out there and see what they may have done. But I guess I want to see if board members would be willing to take a full day, half day, do a virtual retreat, what that might look like, given we may not have to, in the past, we've done a lot of really productive, good work moving the needle forward on doing things like changing ends, brainstorming, strategic vision, things like that, getting updates on, new multimodal transportation, things like that. And we may have to adjust how we do some of that. But is there an appetite, I guess, from the board members for doing anything for a board retreat this year, or just want to hold, tread water until, we come out of the dark ages next year or sometime in the future? So I open it up to the board to discuss. Roger?
Certainly a virtual retreat is not ideal, but I strongly support having a retreat focused on long-term strategic planning. I think we were going to do that this last summer until the pandemic took over, and I don't think we should be delaying for another 6 months or a year, looking where we should be going as an organization, particularly with the pandemic. Certainly when we come out of it, there are going to be a lot of changes to everybody, including public transit. I think we need to start talking about that now.
Thank you, Roger. Anybody else? Mike?
Yep, I agree with Roger. I think we've certainly proved that we can carry on board meetings, committee meetings through this kind of virtual platform. And I think we could also do a retreat. However, I think a full day doing this wouldn't work real well. I would suggest a half a day. You can't do the relaxation in between, the one-on-one communicating. It's more difficult. And I think we tried to stretch it into a full day. The second half of it would be not productive at all. And but I think it's very important not to eliminate having a retreat just because we have a pandemic and can't meet face to face. I certainly agree with what Roger said.
Okay, that's 2 in support. Others? Kyra?
Yeah, I'm in support as well. I think especially because, every board meeting since March has been kind of trying to stay afloat, that it's been difficult to think about long range planning, and we had such good momentum before this with the long range plan, so it'd be nice to revisit that. I also think, if we are going to do a half day retreat, there probably isn't time for this, but we should focus on getting back into board education at some point at board meetings. Maybe now that we've passed the budget, the governance committee can work on that as well. I know it's going to be difficult, like Roger said, to know what things are going to look like in public transit after this, but I think it'd be helpful to start that back up again for us.
Others, yay or nay?
I'm also in favor of doing a retreat because for similar reasons. I think I've spent too much time focusing on the crisis at hand. I'd like to spend some time being forward thinking. And if something I know a lot of annual conferences at the University of Michigan have done, they recognize that it's not healthy to do a video conference all day. What they've done is they've broken certain things up into multiple days. And if we have a topic that warrants an extended discussion, I'd be in favor of doing it over the course of a couple of days. If we
Yeah,
do
I mean,
do
we
this
certainly could
virtually.
break up. I agree with that, Jesse. I was thinking the same thing as Mike was talking, and I'm glad you mentioned that. We could certainly do some. I wouldn't mind seeing, our planning department maybe give us an update and give us some thoughts, and maybe some outside consultants and doing some. And then, to Kyra's point, if we want to have board education about certain topics, we could always do that for a half day at another time. So I'm glad you brought that up, and I would put that out there for discussion. And certainly we couldn't. There's no reason we have to limit ourselves to one half day until the smoke clears. We can do it again and again as often as we think is necessary. Ryan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, my comment was I'm in favor of a retreat. I think that it's important to do and focuses us in looking forward, and so I kind of am echoing the comments that have already been voiced. And certainly to Jesse's point, if it needs discussion warrants a couple of days, or breaking basically a big pie over smaller bites, then that's what needs to happen. But certainly don't think that ignoring or passing a retreat would be wise. I think it would be focusing for all of us, especially those of us that haven't been on the board for as long as others. So that's kind of my thought there.
Kathleen?
I just wanted to share my support with everything that's been said. I think it's really good to possibly not do a full day, but maybe do either one half day or a couple of half days. I really agree with Kyra. We've been so focused on everything that's been going on with the pandemic and putting out fires, I guess is a good way of saying it, that it would be nice to be able to do some really good work and look at our future and really get back into some of the work that we were doing before the pandemic started. So I'm in full support.
Might also give the staff a chance to talk about something other than the crisis du jour, to actually talk about something, forward-looking and positive. Yeah, they might appreciate that. Anybody? Do we have any non-supporters for a board retreat? Maybe I should say that. Okay. So maybe the governance committee will kick some ideas around at the next. We'll put that on our agenda for the next governance committee meeting. We'll kick some ideas around. We'll explore some things. Come back with some ideas for the board to consider in October, hopefully, and then we'll talk about timing, format, get some feedback from the board, and see if we can make this happen. Thank you, everybody, for that. Any other questions on anything in section 4? We'll move on then to section 5, strategy and operational updates from the CEO. So I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I think the main events for this discussion we had a few minutes ago, having to do with the state budget. And again, positive signs. We got to see what the details are, but I hope to start bringing you some blueprints for faster service restoration. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do now. Generally speaking, a lot of our life through the pandemic is pretty well established now. At the operational facilities, our staff are well settled into their new routines. The fleet has probably never been cleaner. I went into the building today for a meeting and was automatically scanned by a new infrared thermometer mounted on a tripod. It was a little unnerving, but it was very accurate. So staff are safe. That's really, really important. Customers are safe. We continue to move people in, I think, a fairly good way. I think Brian has more to say, but one last thing I'll leave you with. I was happy to see, you may remember several months ago, one of the first big decisions we took was to purchase permanent shields for the bus drivers. And I'm happy to let you know that those arrived, and the first one was installed today. So progress, definitely moving forward. With that, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate that. So I do have just a small update slide to show, just a single slide. But before I do that, I would like to take a quick opportunity to introduce the newest member of our senior management team. And we have Mr. Brian Marshall, who has taken over from Reggie Whitlow, who was our acting manager of bus operations. And before I tell you all about Brian, let me just stop and say thank you very much to Reggie Whitlow. It was very helpful to have him slide into that spot and have somebody with the long number of years be able to just keep everything flowing smoothly until we could get Brian Marshall on board. And then unveiling there, we have Brian Marshall. And Brian joins us from really an accomplished transit professional, joins us most recently from California, where he was working at Stanford with their campus transit. But prior to that was at Baton Rouge, and also spent many years with the CTA in Chicago. And so I'm very happy that he is here, and just wanted to take an opportunity to introduce him to the board. And Brian, if there was anything you wanted to say, I'll give you all of about 2 sentences. Oh,
I think Brian froze up on. Oh, there.
okay.
Hello, Brian. And he just tell us a little bit maybe about yourself. And I think after that introduction by Brian, but we're happy to have you. Maybe you can give us a little bit more about your background. Frozen again? Brian, can you hear us? I don't know if you can hear us.
Yeah, well, and I have said many a time during this that as soon as I figure out how to use technology seamlessly, the pandemic will be over.
Okay, now I think I got it.
Okay.
All right. I popped in and popped out, but it's absolutely a pleasure being here. It's really impressive to see employees, especially bus drivers with 30 and 35 years. Today we celebrated a bus driver's 30th anniversary. So it gives me a lot of hope, gives me a sense that employees are really committed. And that's such a big thing in the transit industry where the people lack the commitment. But clearly, Brian and Matt exemplify that kind of commitment. They encourage a real commitment, and which encourages me to make even a greater commitment to leverage all of the resources of the rest of the staff.
Well, thank you, Brian, and welcome to the team. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing you at future board meetings. Congratulations, Brian, on the hire, Brian Smith and Matt, and we'll look forward to working with you, Brian Marshall.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, then we'll, anything else? I think you have a slide for us, Brian.
I do, and we had to hunt long and hard for somebody named Brian just to make it confusing. So we succeeded in that endeavor. Give me just 1 second and I shall pull up my screen here.
I'm going to resist calling the two of you BS and BM, so I won't do that for you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
No. Okay. Sorry, I had a in treatment for Lego Mario there. So what I'm showing you here, we had talked briefly at the Finance Committee about ridership numbers and service increases and how it has gone. And what I didn't have then, but I have now, is really a visual representation of what our service levels have done and how we have reacted and gone through this pandemic. So if I could just walk you very quickly through here at this end of the slide is our 100% of service. And you'll notice looks very similar to what John had presented during his budget presentation. And here in March, we initially dropped down to about 84% of service, and then had in April, we dropped down to what we were referring to as Sunday Plus. So it took us several weeks of the pandemic. Each of these is a week in time during this during the period, and we dropped down to 30% service. But our ridership had dropped several weeks before then, so we were really putting out the service as advertised, and frankly still advertised, essential trips only. We came along to the next bid. We had several bids during the summer. Normally we only have 4 a year, and we had 4 within a very short period of time, which leads me to a quick aside that I want to thank both Ken and Elise for all of the data that went into this chart, and for proofreading it and giving me suggestions as we go through. So thank you to them for that. In May, then we added some frequency. We came to June, we added some park and ride shuttles. Then we came into July, and we continued to add additional service, kind of fitting buses in between wherever we had need for additional buses where the crowding, because during this period we stopped allowing the 60 people on a bus and have dropped that down to 20 people maximum on a bus. And then you can see right here, this edition where we've bumped back up to 62%. That's where we're standing at right now, and this ends at the last week of data from last week. And you can see our ridership that dropped off a cliff, but then has slowly started to build back up as we have added back service. So service restoration continues. As John pointed out, we have plans for additional service restoration this November. And even along the way, what I really wanted to tell with this story was that it's not that we dropped down to a 30% level of service and just stayed there. We weren't stagnant and just waited until something else happened. We were always adding and tweaking and working with planning and trying to figure out what's the next thing, and working with operations, trying to find out where the holes were. And we're going to continue to do that. That's on deck for the rest of the year as we work our way through the pandemic. So with that, that's where we're at for operations. And I would hand it off to Forrest if you wanted to add anything about feedback or planning for the future.
Thanks, Brian. I think we have, as you can tell, we gradually restore some services. Right now, we're working on November. As you already heard, we will add more service in November, continue in January, April. We're working on those plans right now. As soon as we are clear with the state budget, we will be start to communicate what services we're going to add back in. Thanks.
Kathleen, question.
Thank you for the chart, Brian. That was really fascinating to look at. I'm wondering, where are we at with paratransit in terms of level of service and hours? I'm assuming that we saw a giant dip in needs and requests. Are we seeing an increase now that things are sort of lifting up a little bit? And what is that doing to our budget?
So our lots of questions in there. We did see a similar, that's okay. We did see a similar drop off in ridership as you can expect. One of the changes, or one of the things that we didn't change, one of the things that we didn't change was the footprint of where we would go for paratransit, because we couldn't hold the public meetings, because it was an immediate change, even though our fixed route system has shrunk back and our federal obligation is within 3/4 of a mile of our fixed route system, we have kept the exact same footprint for paratransit geographically, so that we make sure that the folks that have really some of the greatest need are able to get where they need to go, and there's no sudden, oh my gosh, what do you mean I can't get there anymore? So that hasn't changed. We have seen a slow increase in the number of rides and requests for trips. However, we are also talking about a population that tends to be some of the most vulnerable to COVID. And so really, I think there has been a reluctance to ride in that regard. We are still limiting the number of people on the vehicles. If it's a larger vehicle, we can fit a few folks, but on the smaller vehicles, it's still only one household per trip. So it has maintained relatively low as we've gone through. So I can develop a similar chart so that you could see what the ridership is on fixed route. The level of service in part is harder to chart because to some extent it's been the same. Probably the biggest major change that I would want to acknowledge is that when we took over service August 1st, we no longer did same day paratransit. And that's a big change. It is temporary and will, as we go forward and figure out what we should be doing, that will be part of the public discussions and determining. And really the same day was a large part of the expense because it's harder to plan for demand that is maybe not there or maybe is there. So it's much easier to plan for trips that are booked in advance.
Without same day, are you providing service? How do they navigate like doctor's appointments? It used to be that they would schedule their trip, but then leave it open-ended so that when their doctor's appointment was done, then they could call for it. Does that fall under the same day then so that they have to schedule their entire trip, or do they get a call back for doctor's appointments?
For doctor's appointments, and actually only doctor's appointments, we have a system, what's called will call, where when they're ready to go, we will send a vehicle out for them. So that is still available for doctor's appointments. The other piece that I should say is still suspended is Gold Ride. So rides for seniors that have no mobility issues and no limitations that would make it difficult for them to ride the fixed routes. We have temporarily suspended that service. However, any senior that was in a situation where, well, I could ride the fixed route, but the fixed route that went right by my house doesn't run anymore, I need ADA because I'm no longer within walking distance, we've been able to grant those as ADA eligible because of the changes and because of the pandemic. So we have really stressed making sure that accessibility to those who really need it is still there throughout this, so that folks are not left without options if we can help it.
Thank you. That's really important, and I appreciate all of your hard work. Thank you.
Others, Mike?
Yeah, it was very encouraging to see, first of all, in John's presentation about the budget, with that brand new chart that showed service increasing. And as I recall, it went from where it is right now to 60% of the former level, up to around 2/3. And obviously, depending on how things go, it could be different and maybe even higher than that. And then, of course, both Brian and Forrest also talked about additional service in the future. I'm curious if you could just address in general how you decide going forward what kind of service, additional service you'd be adding, routes, frequency, whatever. Could you describe the general process, how you will be going about that?
Sure, and I think we're going to be speaking in more detail about this probably in the next 2 months. But big picture, there's the budget envelope, and frankly, what can we afford? We are lucky that we have most of our CARES Act funding still whole, that we can have a conversation about restoring services just as people are starting to come back. But we're still not out of the public health crisis. And so we've made several executive decisions about extending services to hospitals. So St. Joseph, for example, has weekend service for the first time. And frankly, we intend to keep running that because that's going to be necessary for the community for quite some time. A lot of the rest of the process here is, I'll be honest, we've never restored service from a pandemic before. So we're kind of building the airplane as we fly it in some cases. A lot of it is driven by, on one hand, trying to get back the service coverage area that we had before. So we heard a lot about that with Route 47 a few months ago, that there was a coverage gap. We still have a few holes. So coverage creates a very long walking distance for some people, and that's a priority to begin filling those in. At the same time, Brian has a need to maintain social distancing. And if we get more than 20 people on a bus, are we going to put another bus into service to try to reduce that crowding? That's a really tricky one, because what if both buses fill up? But we are also still trying to, what we want to really be able to do is rebuild ridership and be there as people begin to travel again, to be available and to have it be an option that people are comfortable using. So we'll probably speak more about the logic behind how things get restored, but coverage, social distancing, ridership, those are some of the key factors, and all of it, of course, is wrapped up in the budget envelope.
Go ahead, Roger.
I guess both to Brian and Forrest, I'm not really looking for an answer to this, just to have some observations. My observation in certainly the central campus area is that the number of university employees has been dramatically reduced. And when I noticed that even though you've increased service significantly, there's been really very small increase in ridership. I would attribute that to there just aren't very many people going to work in the central part of Ann Arbor right now compared to normal times. Do you have any observations along those lines?
So I do see that. I think we're in fact an example of it at our office, where if you can work from home, you need to work from home. And so Matt has let folks know that that's going to be the way through the end of the year. And I would say that we're not unusual in that regard. There are really only those essential workers that have the need to be in the office every day or show up to drive a bus or what have you. So I do see that travel down. I don't see the ridership really on the campus routes that you would expect, given this time of year. So I would take Jesse's suggestion to heart, where he had mentioned it, I think the service committee, that travel patterns really may change substantially as we come out of this, because remote work is going to, we've proven through fire that remote work is possible, and it may become kind of the new norm, is part of what we may find. The other thing that I would mention is that our trend line really followed the governor's orders. So as we kind of go in and out of hotspots and what have you, I think that's what this has done, is that we followed what everybody else has done. And I'm not sure, well, we've led actually in some cases, but our numbers have followed what the mandates have been from our governor, is what I mean to say. So I'm not sure if all of that answered your question or if Forrest has anything to add, but.
Well, I think going back to, the comment I heard from the committee discussions, what do we use for future planning or right now for the existing planning? Are we using the information we have from the past, pre-pandemic, or do we use some information we observing right now? I think I can answer that we kind of combine all the information we've been hearing or seeing, or even from the ridership, financial data, everything. I think, Roger, going back to your question, it could be a new pattern, or is a greater opportunity for us to understand the market, who, really need transit. It really depends on transit. I think during this pandemic, we can observe a lot of those things. People who have other options, they probably gonna drive, or maybe will continue driving for a while. But those continue using our service during the pandemic, it's really those people who may not have other options. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to gather those information and then do our future planning based on, pandemic or the information we collected during this pandemic, and then to make a more informative decision. So.
Thank you. I
Raymond,
appreciate the observations.
Sorry, go ahead, Raymond.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for this presentation. I find it fascinating. One thing I would request is that we get an updated version of this chart periodically. I'll let you determine what makes the most sense, if it's, maybe every other month or so. Roger took a little bit of my thunder in that I was surprised that there was no discernible uptick at the beginning of the school year for the university. Between faculty and staff, and as well as students, I would have expected to see kind of the university bump, and it's pretty negligible. The other thing that I find fascinating about it is, level of service for transit is really kind of your driving in traditional sense. The level and quality of service you provide really determines your ridership level. But this graph shows that in these times, that's not at all true, right? Because we were maintaining, I think I saw 80% service when our ridership was down to, bottomed out at whatever it was, 10% or so. And even though we've been stepping up service, we've only seen marginal gains in terms of ridership. So, I think this also underscores the need for us to have that retreat that we just talked about, right? Start really thinking about long-term planning, start thinking about, if, to the point I guess Jesse's made in the past, and one we've talked about at the city as well, is, will there be a new normal? Hopefully the normal we're in today is not the new normal, but it may permanently shift some habits of folks, whether that's telecommuting, whether that's other things. And if so, what do we need to do as an agency to prepare for that? And so I think it just kind of underscores a couple of the conversations we've already had. I've been, again, beating that drum about restoring service, but then I see graphs like this, and it's a bit of a head scratcher for me, because it kind of turns the traditional formula on its head. So thank you for this. I'd like to see these reports continued. I like the way you juxtaposed level of service against ridership. I think that was really insightful, and I like it being presented like that. And it may even address some of the issues that Rich brought up earlier in the meeting about, service and ridership and that sort of thing. So I think this one slide was a very powerful one, and thanks for sharing it with us.
Roger?
Yeah, just a little follow-up. The graph that Brian, the hours of service and ridership, in my business, I'm seeing in the campus area, I'm finding a very similar pattern of hours of service versus actual patrons. So it is an abnormal situation. But again, it looks very familiar to me.
I think it also underscores and supports our strategy of being very conservative with our CARES Act money. Other people who wanted us to dump it all in and spend it all in the first, 4 weeks. I think the graph that Brian showed us supports our approach to how we're spending our CARES Act money, which is incrementally and as needed. So, anybody else from the board who wants to weigh in on this issue? Other questions?
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Go ahead, Jason.
I'm Brian Smith. I'm very gratified to hear that you took my question to heart from the service committee meeting. I'm looking. I found your chart very, very striking, and I'm really curious how if this is a system-wide number. I'm really, really curious. I guess like the transit wonk in me is just very interested in what the route by route numbers, like, do they all fit that pattern, or are there certain routes that are seeing a higher increase in proportional increase in ridership versus other routes where we're not seeing that? They're all just kind of averaging out to this number. I think there really is an opportunity here to see, as Mr. Yang said, like, who really needs transit, who's really relying on it. And I think that these numbers that we're getting now have a potential to really inform our decisions for years to come, because we're having a chance to see that. Where if people aren't going to be commuting as much, then we have a chance, like I said, to really see who needs transit. And I'm hoping that we can be taking advantage of this situation to see what it's revealed about our ridership.
Thank you.
Can do.
Anybody else? Board on this item? Okay. Then I think the last item under strategy operational updates is the CEO report, which is on page 49. I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of updates to things on here. And Keith, if you want to bring the video up while I'm speaking, then that would be fine. First of all, at the bottom of the first page, the acknowledgement about our staff survey. Every year we do a staff survey. This year it was delayed because of the pandemic, so we didn't think it was appropriate to do it earlier. So it closed yesterday, and I'm happy to report that it appears that participation is at an all-time high. We had over 50% of staff responding to that survey. I have not yet seen the results. It probably won't come in for another few days, but I'm very eager and a little scared to see what we have to say. It's been an extraordinary year without precedent, and I really want to hear from staff. So I'm really gratified that so many people participated, and I'm expecting some strong opinions, both in favor of management decisions and frankly against them. So probably not a year where there's a lot of people in the middle. People probably have strong opinions, but I'm happy to let you know, an all-time high of feedback. So when we get more information, perhaps we'll be able to share that. Another thing that's not on here is a more emergent issue, has to do with an announcement recently made by the state pertaining to a corridor between Detroit and Ann Arbor for autonomous vehicles. And this is sort of an emerging project. We are involved. Forrest and I have attended a couple of briefings from the state personnel overseeing the project. We've got another briefing coming up from the project company. It's called Cavenue, as in Avenue. It's a very unclear project that is emerging. There did get some media attention. We're going to learn more about it, and we're going to report back to you on what it looks like. It's primarily focused, frankly, between Detroit and the American Center for Mobility in Ypsilanti. So it really actually doesn't come a whole lot into our area, but they also have aspirations to continue whatever it is into the city of Ann Arbor, maybe up to the M-City area on the northeast side. But even what it is very unclear. Is it infrastructure? Is it a dedicated lane? If you want to visit the Cavenue website, you can see some very nice animation about it. But there are also some very real questions about what this is. It does appear to be a private company interested in monetizing the public right-of-way, of somehow turning it into a profit center for investors. So that should raise some questions for us about who's using the public rights-of-way and for what purpose. And then finally, I have yet to see how a private company is going to turn this into a revenue stream. So it strikes me as a little bit of a venture capital exercise where, frankly, I have no idea if it's going to work out as the business. I don't see how they're going to make money on it, but who knows? Could be wrong. So we'll learn more about it, and I'll let you know. So one last thing on this report, and maybe I'll ask John to introduce this because he's been closest to it, is a little bit of a video about another one of our recent projects. So John, do you want to introduce this?
Of course, happy to. As you all remember, the board approved a project a month or two ago to launch mobile ticketing. And so I'm happy to announce that our Easy Fare mobile ticketing project has moved forward and will go live next week on Wednesday, September 30th. That's the day when mobile ticket fares will be available for fixed route riders and paratransit riders. They'll be able to buy single rides, day passes, monthly passes, as well as single rides and companion fares for A rides. So there'll be some marketing and media coming out shortly after the September 30th launch, but we wanted to share this little promotional video with you tonight to give the board and the public a preview of what this is. Mike?
So thank you, John, and that's an exciting video, and hopefully we'll be able to roll that out to other people soon with the launch of that new program. So with that, Mr. Chair, happy to see if there are any questions, happy to respond.
Thank you. Glad to see the Easy Fare get off the ground. That'll be a big ad. Anybody from the board, any comments, questions on anything? Okay. I'll close out section 5. We'll go to section 6, emergent business. Any emergent business from anybody this evening? All right, closing items then. We got topics for next meeting, policies 211 and 210 on the agenda. We'll bring the board retreat stuff back. Perhaps if we have a recommendation from finance on the 2.4 adjustment language, we'll have something there. So we'll see how that goes, but we can add those to the agenda as well. But we've got 211, 210 on the agenda. Move to 7.2. Any other, well, anything else, topics for next meeting that anybody wants to make sure we don't lose sight of it this point? Kathleen?
Sorry, I was wondering if we could get an update at our next board meeting from Mr. Smith with regards to where we're at with Phoenix and the quantum and the other studies that that we're in the process of doing. If we could just kind of get a ballpark of what's going on, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. So we got a thumbs up for that. We can do that. Others? All right. We'll move then to public comment. Again, you have 3 minutes to address the board. Please state your name for the record. Either hit the raise your hand button or *9. So we'll open it up and I'll go to Mr. Book to let us know if there's anybody who wants to speak.
Chairman Mahler, we have Jim Mogensen. Mr. Mogensen, you've been unmuted.
Yes. So a couple things to bring up. The first is it is amazing. Now we're in fall, and soon, amazingly enough, we will be in winter. And I bring this up as a planning thing because when winter comes, transit patterns can change for people who have difficulty getting to and using the fixed route service during when there's a snowstorm and extremely cold weather. So, and people are going to be utilizing the service in different ways. The other thing is the issue of so I am a person who is probably not qualified for ADA service, but I need a walker if I go long distances. So if I go on a bus, I have to use a walker. And this is a perennial problem because the buses are not set up to deal with walkers. And why this matters is as the ADA restrictions change, as the TheRide restrictions change, it could leave a subset of the community in this very odd and awkward situation. So I just bring that up. I was asked by a member of the City Council of Ann Arbor, so Jim, could you explain transit funding? We'll be glad to say I said no. It's incredibly complicated, and 3 of those people have retired. You know, there's 5 people that know. But that, for example, when I was brought up at a former board meeting about both the TheRide and the D2A2 A2D2, I have a sense that how I think I understand how TheRide works. But that's because I think they use it as an interurban subsidy, perhaps, to make that happen. And then that's in a very strange place. If there's any way to make it as clear as possible about how these financing things work, so to extend some of those financial statements, that would be helpful, I think, as things move forward. And lastly, the issue of the documents, the website has been changed. It's Rider Forward, and I was able to find most stuff, but I'm hoping to be able to see the slides that were given and the presentations that were given tonight. And I couldn't find the budget documents on the website. So so I know you have them and I know they're there. I just need to figure out where they are. So thank you very much as always for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Chairman Mahler, we have another caller. The last 3 digits are 306. You've been unmuted.
Hello, this is Michelle Barney. Chittister Place in Ipsy, city of Ipsy. I have several things and too many to do in this time. I want to know who, if anyone, could I talk to? One of them is the LAC. Has it begun meeting again? If so, I haven't heard about it, and I would like to talk to somebody about attending, which I have done several times. Another thing, the new vehicles that she's buying. They're buying all kinds of vehicles, all in different sizes and styles, all very large. But that's financial, that's your problem. But the problem for me is that the ramp that comes out is extremely down. I have to ask the driver to hold it because I slide down. I can't go as fast as gravity. And in winter, when it's icy, it's going to be terrible. I'd like to know, for information's sake, what the AATA policy is should there be protests in the streets along which the buses or the A-rides ride, because those protests are not going to stop. Hopefully they will remain peaceful, but they're not going to stop. It'll be harder to get masses of people out in the winter, but there will be an attempt to keep them going because what has been done in each city is not good. And finally, you sent us a newspaper-like mailing that, among other things, lists all the bus routes that are staying in place for now, and it says every half hour, every whatever. What it doesn't say anywhere is which half hour. Some of them are hour and half hour, some of them are like 20 minutes past and 40 minutes past. There's no way to find that out, and I've tried going to the bus stations and taking pictures with my camera of the schedules I need, but on a phone it's not working. It isn't legible. The pictures I take are not legible. Any chance of putting sheets in the bus terminals, one route to a sheet, so that people can take the ones they need? Otherwise, we have to call information, and they're very busy on the phone. It's very hard to get through. Now, who can I ask about these things when they can talk to me? Or write them a note? Who would I drop a note to?
We'll have somebody from the staff contact you about that, Ms. Barney.
Good, thank you. Thank you, thank you. That's all then, and thank you for the hard work you're doing.
Thank you. Keith, do we have any other speakers this evening?
We do not, Chairman. Oh, yep. Oh, nope. Oh, yeah. It was just Ms. Barney. Nope. No one else.
Okay. Don't forget the board assessment meeting. It's electronic in your packet. Please fill that out and return it to Keith. Then 7-4, can I have somebody move for adjournment? Roger, seconded by Kathleen. So we'll move to adjourn, yes or no? Mike?
Yes.
Rich?
Yes.
Roger?
Yes.
Kyra?
Yes.
Kathleen?
Yes.
Ryan?
Yes.
Jesse?
Yes.
Raymond?
Yes.
And I'm also a yes. Thank you, everybody, for your hard work and for a smooth, productive meeting. We are adjourned. Thank you.
Good night.